They don't explode, they erode inside the mind of a covert passive-aggressive narcissist. You may be wondering, perhaps quietly, perhaps with a knot in your stomach, whether you are dealing with a covert passive-aggressive narcissist. Many people don't even know such a personality type exists until they are already entangled in its emotional web. Psychologists note that covert narcissism is one of the hardest forms to recognize because it doesn't look like narcissism at all. There's no obvious arrogance, no loud self-promotion, no theatrical grandiosity. Instead, there is confusion, self-doubt, and a lingering sense that something feels deeply wrong even when nothing obvious has happened. I didn't know what a covert passive-aggressive narcissist was either until I found myself inside the experience. Clinical psychologists often describe this moment as the awakening phase, when a victim begins to realize that the emotional pain they're experiencing is not random, not mutual, and not their fault. By the time you truly understand what you're dealing with, you're often already emotionally depleted. The goal, as psychologists emphasize, is not merely recognition, but early detection and self-protection before the psychological damage becomes severe. I want to be clear about something psychologists repeatedly stress. Narcissistic abuse does not discriminate. It does not target weakness, it targets empathy. I am a seasoned attorney, confident, accomplished, and professionally recognized. For decades, I negotiated high-conflict cases and faced aggressive personalities daily. And yet, I became the target of not one, but two covert passive-aggressive narcissists in my personal life. This is an important psychological reality. Strength does not immunize you against manipulation. In fact, narcissists are often drawn to competent, resilient individuals because those traits supply what they lack internally. Psychologists describe the narcissistic dynamic as a progression. First, you are the target, idealized, admired, subtly bonded. Then you become the victim, slowly absorbing blame, confusion, and emotional erosion. If you're fortunate and supported, you eventually become the survivor, able to name what happened and reclaim your sense of self. Recovery, psychologists note, begins the moment clarity replaces confusion. Understanding covert narcissism requires context. Clinically, narcissism exists on a spectrum. The grandiose narcissist is the most recognizable, the boastful, entitled personality who loudly announces their superiority. Then there is the malignant narcissist, a more dangerous subtype associated with intimidation, threats, stalking behaviors, and, in extreme cases, violence. These individuals externalize their rage openly. They are frightening, but they are visible. Covert passive-aggressive narcissists are different, and psychologists often warn they can be more psychologically destructive precisely because they hide in plain sight. These individuals appear gentle, wounded, self-critical, even depressed. They openly talk about their insecurities, their sadness, their illnesses, their unfair treatment by the world. This vulnerability disarms empathy. Mental health experts explain that this is not accidental. It is a strategic presentation that invites caretaking while deflecting accountability. At the psychological core of all narcissism is what clinicians describe as a hollow self-structure. There is no stable internal sense of identity or self-worth. This is why narcissists require constant external validation. They are not confident, they are profoundly insecure. And this insecurity creates a dangerous attraction between narcissists and empaths. Empaths are neurologically wired to attune, to soothe, to help. Narcissists, lacking internal regulation, instinctively gravitate toward those who can regulate emotions for them. With covert passive-aggressive narcissists, this dynamic intensifies. Psychologists observe that these individuals often frame themselves as perpetual victims. They may present chronic illnesses, emotional fragility, or repeated life hardships that conveniently position you as the rescuer. At the same time, they appear extraordinarily kind, charming, and nice. This creates cognitive dissonance for the victim. How could someone so gentle be harmful? One of the most illuminating resources on this topic is Debbie Mears's work on covert narcissism. Clinicians widely reference her framework because it articulates what victims feel but cannot yet articulate themselves. As I read her descriptions, I experienced what psychologists call pattern recognition shock. the moment when scattered experiences suddenly align into a coherent, unsettling truth. Covert passive-aggressive narcissists share a constellation of traits that psychologists repeatedly document. They lack a solid sense of self, which leads to chronic envy and unspoken rage. Their anger is rarely explosive. Instead, it is expressed through silence, withholding, passive aggression, and subtle punishment. They criticize constantly, but deny doing so. They project their own flaws onto you, making you feel responsible for emotions that were never yours to begin with. Their words rarely match their actions, a phenomenon psychologists refer to as behavioral incongruence, which destabilizes the victim's reality testing. They may triangulate others, what clinicians call flying monkeys, to validate their narrative and isolate you socially. They take credit for your ideas, withhold praise, sabotage meaningful events, and belittle your achievements, all while maintaining an outwardly innocent demeanor. Psychologically, these behaviors erode the victim's identity over time. Victims report feeling dizzy in conversations, second-guessing themselves, replaying interactions endlessly. This is not accidental. Psychologists identify this as intermittent reinforcement, a trauma bonding mechanism that keeps victims emotionally hooked despite ongoing harm. Perhaps most painful of all is that covert narcissists do not truly want connection. They have no genuine interest in knowing you, understanding you, or building a mutually fulfilling relationship. What they want is control, validation, and emotional regulation supplied by you. Love becomes transactional. Affection comes with strings. Intimacy is replaced by extraction. Recovery, psychologists emphasize, begins with naming the pattern without minimizing it. Protection comes from boundaries, disengagement, and rebuilding trust in your own perception. Victims heal by reconnecting with their intuition, learning to tolerate the discomfort of walking away, and understanding that empathy does not require self-sacrifice. If this story feels familiar, it's not because you are weak. It's because you are perceptive, compassionate, and human. And with clarity, support, and education, survival becomes freedom. What makes these relationships so psychologically destabilizing, according to trauma psychologists, is the paradox at their core. The covert passive-aggressive narcissist both idolizes and attacks you at the same time. You are placed on a pedestal, admired for your intelligence, competence, warmth, or strength, while simultaneously being undermined through subtle cruelty, neglect, and sabotage. Clinicians describe this as a form of splitting, where the narcissist cannot hold a stable, integrated view of another person. You are either a source of validation or a threat to their fragile self-image, and they oscillate between those positions without warning. For the victim, this creates a surreal emotional environment, one where affection and harm coexist so tightly that the nervous system stays in a constant state of confusion and hypervigilance. Psychologists emphasize that escaping this world of insanity, as many survivors describe it, is not weakness, it is neurological self-preservation. When leaving is not immediately possible, the only protective option is the creation of rigid, non-negotiable boundaries. This is where many victims struggle because narcissists, by clinical definition, do not respect boundaries. Boundaries imply separateness, and narcissists experience separateness as abandonment or attack. From their perspective, your limits feel like rejection, which triggers shame and rage. That is why psychologists often warn that boundaries with narcissists are not requests. They are safety structures that must be enforced consistently, without explanation or emotional negotiation. Most psychologists agree that relationships with covert passive-aggressive narcissists follow a predictable three-phase cycle. The first phase is idealization, commonly referred to as love bombing. During this stage, the narcissist mirrors your values, your interests, and your emotional language with uncanny precision. Neuropsychologists explain that this mirroring creates a powerful dopamine bond. It feels intoxicating, euphoric, almost unreal. You may find yourself thinking, this person understands me like no one ever has. In reality, they are studying you, unconsciously learning which traits to reflect back in order to secure attachment and control. The second phase, devaluation, arrives quietly, almost invisibly. With covert passive-aggressive narcissists, the cruelty is so subtle that it barely registers at first. Psychologists describe this as microaggression abuse, where the harm occurs through omission, contradiction, and quiet disrespect rather than overt attacks. Small agreements are broken. Promises dissolve. Something feels off, but nothing feels dramatic enough to justify confrontation. When you do speak up, you are met with gentle denial. That's not what we agreed on. You misunderstood. You said that was fine. Over time, this creates what clinicians call gaslighting-induced cognitive erosion, where the victim begins to distrust their own memory, perception, and emotional responses. Money, psychologists note, is a particularly common arena for this behavior because it blends power, control, and plausible deniability. Funds are accidentally misdirected. Corrections are promised but never completed. When questioned, the narcissist appears calm, reasonable, and confused, while the victim feels increasingly anxious and guilty for even asking. Outsiders often dismiss these incidents as mistakes because the narcissist's public persona is so agreeable. This social reinforcement deepens the victim's isolation and self-doubt, a dynamic psychologists identify as secondary invalidation trauma. The slow drip of these behaviors during the devaluation phase is what causes the most psychological damage. Each incident alone seems trivial. Together, they form a relentless pattern that conditions the victim to minimize their own needs. Debbie Mears's example of the forgotten coffee captures this perfectly. Psychologists point out that the harm is not about the coffee, it's about the repeated message, "You do not matter enough to be remembered." Over time, the victim internalizes this message, often reframing it as personal selfishness rather than recognizing it as systematic emotional neglect. Empaths are especially vulnerable here. Psychological research shows that empathic individuals are more likely to self-blame and overfunction in relationships. When paired with a narcissist, whose relational orientation is to take rather than reciprocate, the imbalance becomes extreme. To a narcissist, your worth is entirely transactional. Psychologists refer to this as narcissistic supply. The emotional, social, financial, or status-based resources you provide that stabilize their fragile ego. Once that supply diminishes, so does your perceived value. This is why endings are particularly volatile. When you attempt to disengage, whether emotionally, professionally, or relationally, the narcissist experiences it as an existential threat. Clinically, this triggers narcissistic injury, which can lead to rage, smear campaigns, manipulation, and desperate attempts to regain control. Psychologists warn that covert narcissists often preemptively rewrite the narrative, casting themselves as the victim and you as the aggressor. This is not accidental. It is a survival strategy to preserve their self-image and social standing. What's critical to understand from a psychological standpoint is that beneath all this chaos lies an extraordinarily fragile personality structure. Narcissists present as powerful, but internally they resemble what psychologists describe as developmentally arrested selves, emotionally stuck at a stage where shame feels annihilating. This is why, paradoxically, when confronted with firm strategy, leverage, and emotional disengagement, many narcissists retreat. Like playground bullies, they rely on compliance, not resistance. When the supply dries up and the risk outweighs the reward, they often move on to a new target. Recovery for the victim involves more than leaving. It requires rebuilding trust in one's own perception. Trauma-informed psychologists emphasize the importance of education, validation, and strategic detachment. Understanding the pattern restores sanity. Boundaries restore agency. Support restores identity. And while the process is painful, survivors consistently report a profound sense of clarity and relief once the fog lifts. If you are in this position now, know this: the confusion you feel is not a flaw. It is a symptom of psychological manipulation. And clarity, once gained, is power.